Today we're going to be replacing the expansion valve on a 2007 Honda Pilot.
Seriously, I just had it.
When the air conditioning compressor goes out on these Honda Pilots, the debris and stuff that gets into the lines can cause problems down the line. So a lot of automotive repair shops won't just replace the compressor. They'll want to replace the evaporator core and the condenser and the lines and the compressor, the whole system, and it can end up costing thousands of dollars. And so I've found a workaround to that, and I'm going to share that with you today. Real quick disclaimer, whenever you're doing this on your own, this is not exactly the proper way to do things. This is something that someone can do in their garage if you have the know-how and the proper tools and don't have an AC service unit they're like $5,000. But this is something that you can do at your home. Normally, you would pull the refrigerant out using a machine, and then you would draw a vacuum on the machine once you get it back together to pull any excess moisture out. And do it that way. If you don't have access to those machines, or you don't have the funds or whatever, or a mechanic that you can trust to do this sort of thing for you, this is just a workaround that I found worked for me, and it's just a neat little trick that you can use to change out the expansion valve, which does kind of act like a filter in these cars because it doesn't have an orifice tube. It doesn't actually have a filter anywhere in the system. The expansion valve actually kind of acts like a filter because there's a little bit of a choke point there. So I found that when my compressor went in our Pilot, I immediately turned off the air conditioning so that it wasn't getting a bunch of debris and other stuff in the system, kind of messing things up, and pulled all the refrigerant out, and then got the new compressor, put it in, and it worked just fine for about 2 weeks. And then I started having icing issues, and it was the expansion valve that did have a little bit of debris in there. So I actually put a new expansion valve in, and we got about 9 or 10 months out of it before I had to put another one in, and that's what I'm doing today. So this will actually be the second time I'm doing this. So I'm just showing you what I did and a quick runaround fix that won't cost $1,500. It'll probably cost more like 50 or 100 bucks. So hope this helps you out. Enjoy the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The tools you're going to need for this project are going to be an 8mm, 10mm, both 3/8 deep well and shallow well and 1/4 inch drive, and a couple of miscellaneous sockets, extensions, ratchets. You'll need a 19mm wrench, 17mm wrench, 15/16, and if you have a 1 1/16 wrench, great. If you don't, use an adjustable crescent wrench. You'll need a drill with at least a 1/4 inch bit and a step drill bit, which will come in really handy. I'll show you that in a minute. Another thing that you're going to need will be a can of refrigerant and also a hose. If you go to the parts store, you can actually get one of these. They normally come with a bigger can, but they'll have a gauge on it to tell you where your pressure is whenever you go to start filling the system back up. And if you do have it, a set of AC gauges and a little thermometer to tell you what the temperature is. To do this yourself, you're going to need a couple of specialty tools, but there are a couple of cheaper workarounds that I found that work out pretty well. If you don't have a set of, proper AC gauges, you can go to your local parts store and you can get a couple of these guys, which can help to recharge your system, but it won't give you an accurate pressure reading as far as what you have in your system whenever you go to recharge. The first thing you want to do is either have a automotive shop pull the refrigerant out of the vehicle, and if you are like me and have a couple of empty cans laying around, you can actually pull the refrigerant out of the system and put it into 2 empty cans, and that'll help save the refrigerant, and it won't atmospherically dump it, which is not necessarily good for the environment either. And this stuff isn't super cheap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hook it up to the gauges, and I'm going to fill my empties, and I'm going to pull all the stuff that I possibly can out of the system prior to draining the system completely, and we can start in on things. The 2 connection spots are the high pressure side, which is right down here near the power steering reservoir, and your low pressure side is right up here. That's where you're going to hook up your gauges in order to pull the refrigerant out. Again, if you don't have a proper set of gauges, you can use one of these little tubes and an empty can, if you have one, in order to pull the refrigerant out. You just hook it up, and then you undo the valve here, and then the refrigerant will flow into this, and then you close the valve again, pull it off, repeat the process. You will need 2 of these guys. They're like 7 or 8 bucks at Advanced Auto Parts. But I'm going to hook up my gauges, and I'm going to pull it out using my gauges. So far, I have filled 1 can, and Since I can't disconnect this and hook up another one without losing the refrigerant, I'm actually going to use this little trick that I was telling you all about. And I'm going to hook this up right here and then just open this valve. You can hear the refrigerant coming out of the system and going into the can. Once you fill 2 to 3 of the cans with the refrigerant that you're drawing out to try to reclaim it, what you want to do is bleed off the rest of the pressure of the system. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my gauges and I'm just going to bring it over here. I'm going to put this end into a bucket. That'll get the rest of the pressure out of there. And if you have any tracking dye or something like that in your system, if it's been serviced before, that sort of thing, any of those oils and stuff will end up in a bucket and not all over the place. If you're doing this, in your backyard or something, and you're using one of these guys, you can use that too. Just you'll probably want to get like a small bucket or something under it so that it doesn't end up all over the place. Another quick tip for whenever you're getting the remainder of the refrigerant out of the vehicle, take it from the low pressure side up here, because if you take it from the high pressure side, a lot of your oils and stuff will be down on this side, and if you don't want to get PAG oil and tracker dye and all that stuff everywhere, if you pull it from the low side, you'll have less of that going into your bucket. You can see there's just a tiny little bit of oil in there, not a big deal, but that's how you get it out. Unfortunately, I hate to waste the refrigerant, and that just kind of stinks, but I don't have a $5,000 AC machine, so here we are. Moving along to the interior of the car, you're going to need to pull a couple of pieces off in order to get the glove box out and gain access to the air conditioning system on the inside. So you're going to need to pull this trim piece off. It just kind of has these 3 clips that will come out. On the interior, where the fuse panel access is, you'll need to pull this piece off as well in order to get to the screw on the underside here. There are 2 screws, one here and one on the far side that you need to get out. They're just Phillips heads. So you need to pull this plastic keeper out of the way. Usually you can just reach up, pull that tab off, and then this whole piece will come out. Pretty easy stuff. You just reach underneath with your 8mm. And take this guy out. And there's one. And moving to the other side, we're going to take this guy out as well. On the upper side, you want to support the bottom as you unlatch this, because if you don't, it will fall out. On either side, there are 2 tabs, and you will pull them out and in towards yourself. Pull that out, and they just weasel out. I'm just going to set that in there for safekeeping. And then you just slide that guy out of the way. That will give you access to this portion, which is where the really fun part starts. When these came from the factory, there was a piece of plastic that runs from here the whole way to the other side here. In order to change out the in-cabin air filter, you need to remove that, and you also need to remove this bar right here. And the bolts to access that, there's one here and one on this side. We're just going to take our 8mm, and there are a couple of bolts that hold this guy in and get the guy out on the left. Then this bar right here will just come down on the right first, and then you slide it out. You might need to pull this plastic back just a wee bit. I think there's a little tab on it right there that will hold it into place. To gain access to the in-cabin air filter, you undo a clip on the bottom, and then this piece will come off. And then you can just slide the in-cabin air filter out, and you just set all this stuff aside. If you look in, the expansion valve is right here. It has 2 lines going into the front and the 2 coming out of the back side. These expansion valves act as a filter, and sometimes if your your AC compressor goes, it will clog up that valve, and you will get mediocre cold air coming out of the front air conditioning. And if you have rear AC, 9 times out of 10, you're gonna have really cold rear AC, but not very cold front AC, because it doesn't allow the refrigerant to flow through because the valve is clogged up. So that's the part we're going to be replacing, and I'm going to show you how to get in there and weasel it out without having to disassemble the entire dash. One of the things that I can't show you in this video, because I've already done it, is I've taken a step drill bit and I have drilled into the box to about the size of a 3/4 right next to this mounting tab for this bracket here. And the reason I do that is just so that I can fit a 4mm 3/8 drive Allen into the hole in order to gain access to the 2 Allen heads that are here and here, and you'll need to undo those, and it's almost impossible to get in there unless you drill a hole in it. And then whenever you're all done up, you can just take some Gorilla Tape, one piece on the back side and one piece on the front, to plug up that hole. Using your 4mm Allen key, you come through, go through your hole, and these guys, if memory serves, are relatively long, but you'll just break them loose and they should come out relatively easily. Once we get these bolts out, we'll move back under the hood, because you're going to need to disconnect the lines from the front side in order to get some separation between the expansion valve and those lines, just enough to weasel that guy out of there. Back under the hood, the 2 lines that you're going to need to disconnect are this one and this one. In order to pull those apart, you're going to need a 19mm and a 17mm for the lower one, and you're going to need a 15/16 and I think a 1 1/16 wrench. I don't have a wrench that size, so I'm going to use an adjustable crescent wrench to break those loose. Now I've got my 2 wrenches on there, and you're going to want 2 of them because you don't want to tweak the lines whenever you're disconnecting these. It'll take a little bit of finagling and leaning in over things, but once you get them broken loose, they come apart relatively easily. So there's the upper one. You want to be careful when pulling these apart too, because when you do, there are O-rings in there and you don't want to mess those up. Again, it doesn't take a whole lot of force to break these guys loose. So now you can see I've got these keepers loose, and now we're going to move up towards the front just a little bit. You're going to need to take this 10mm bolt out, just so that you can move this line and it's flexible here. The lower one's a little bit more difficult because it's connected to the rear AC if you have it, but you'll take out this 10mm bolt and that'll give you some wiggle room to move those lines out of the road. There are 3 10mm bolts that you'll need to move in order to wiggle this line. There's one here, and there's one in the back. You can see where my ratchet's attached to it, and then there's one buried just underneath this wire loom right there. You'll need to take those 3 out in order to wiggle this line enough to get some separation between where it connects into the expansion valve on the inside of the car. Once you get those 3 bolts out, you'll be able to just pull this guy aside. You can see that I'm losing a little bit of tracker die coming out of the hole there, but you want to pull those aside and just kind of wiggle them out, just to give you enough room to move those lines on the inside. You're probably going to lose a little bit of PAG oil in through there and a little bit of tracker die, but that's no big deal. Moving back into the interior of the car, what I do in this situation is I just take my 3/8 extension and I push it right against the back side, the lines that go out to the front. Just give it a little tap and it should come apart, which it did. Now that that's apart, do the same thing, grabbing here on this line, hold it back, and then hold your extension and just give it a little love tap. And the expansion valve at this point will be loose. You may need to go up to the front of the car and pull those lines forward just a little bit in order to give yourself enough room to get the expansion valve the whole way out. I moved to the front of the car and I wiggled that line, and the expansion valve actually fell out. So what you'll do is you'll grab it, and there's a little spot right here where you can just get the top side and just pop it right out. And there you have it. There's your expansion valve. If you have any tracker die that does fall down, or PAG oil that falls down into this area, now would be a good time to get a set of like needle nose pliers, and then just like a shop rag and or a cleaning rag, and clean it up so that in the future, if you think you might have a leak somewhere, you're not looking at the oil you spilled rather than the actual leak. So just tidy up any excess that you might have in through there. Here's the old expansion valve. I've tried to tidy it up a little bit. It's still leaking oil and stuff all over my hands. But what happens with these is the refrigerant comes in and then this little needle valve lets it flow through. And if your compressor goes, it'll catch all the debris right in through this area here, and it won't allow refrigerant to pass through the valve. And if it doesn't, it can't flow through your core, and therefore you'll get weak or no AC. I've got really, really cold rear AC. There is a little bit of dirt and stuff in there, and it doesn't take much to plug that tiny little hole and stop flow. Here's the new valve. I got this at Advance Auto Parts. It was $47 in tax. Comes with new O-rings, which we'll install, and we'll put this guy back together the same way we took it apart. It can be rather difficult to get these guys back in, especially if you have big gorilla paws like I do. But the trick is to get it on the front side closest to you first, just like that. You get it on there first, and then you'll reach in through the back and line up the back side in order to get the next two lines in, and then you put your bolts in and snug them down and start the reassembly process. Another little trick that I'll share with you in putting these guys in, once you get it seated on there, if you take the two bolts that go through, it'll actually hold it on there a little bit more securely so that whenever you move around to the front to move the lines around and get those reseated onto the back side of the expansion valve, this thing won't fall into the box, and you won't have to start over again. After a couple of trips to the front of the car under the engine and back into here to see what I was working with, the two lines on the back side, it can be a little bit difficult to line up and get back in there, and they're difficult to reach in and grab from this side because you're limited in space. So you just a couple trips back and forth just to get things lined up, and then once you do, you can take the bolts, which you've already pre-installed, and just start snugging them down a little bit. Do one side and then go over to the other, and then just tighten them down, and it should draw together. Now, these guys don't need to be super tight, but you do want to make sure that they're good and snugged up. You want to just be extra careful because they are aluminum and they're real easy to strip out those hex heads. So you just want to get them in there and snug them up. And again, if you dripped any oil into the interior of the air box, you just clean that up with a rag. Now that we have this portion finished up, I'm just going to take a piece of black Gorilla Tape and I'm going to come in from the back side, and I am going to secure it over the hole on the back side. You can see it's all plugged up now, and then you just take a second piece and put it over top on the outside, and then you smush it together over top of the hole. And doing that will make sure that this stuff doesn't come apart. If you use Gorilla Tape, you know what I'm talking about. Now at this point, you don't want to put your air filter or any of this back together, because you do want to get everything reconnected, recharge the system, and then double check for leaks prior to putting everything back together. Because if you have a leak and it's on the interior here, you want to know about it well before you put everything back together. Back at the front of the car, we're just going to reconnect our two lines on the front side. There's one. And there's two. You'll probably need to hold a little bit of pressure on this upper one just to keep it in line until you can get things started on. Okay, now we're going to take our wrenches and we're going to snug up these two lines, and then we're going to put in our 10mm bolts, the three that we removed in order to wiggle the lines out of the way. Now that I've got the lines all snugged up and my three 10mm bolts in, I'm just going to take a cleaning towel and go over these areas over top of the connections where the tracker die leaked out, just so I can clean that up and get a good visual after I recharge the system for any leaks with a UV light. Now that I've got everything buttoned back up, I am reconnecting all of my hoses to my gauge and the bottle of refrigerant. Now I can open this valve to let the reclaimed refrigerant out. You can kind of hear it whistle a little bit. And then I'm going to undo the side, and you can see the pressure gauge starting to move already. You will need to start your car and get the refrigerant circulating. You'll run your AC on high. That will drain anything that's left in the tank. And then I'll do the same thing with this guy. With the car running and your gauge is hooked up, you'll want to make sure that your AC compressor is clicking on and off, which it is, which means we do have refrigerant in the system, but we're gonna need to get a little bit more. So I'm gonna hook up a new can to my gauges here, and I'm gonna fill it the rest of the way with refrigerant. For test purposes, I'm running the car and I put this back on so that I can redirect airflow to the vents. As you can see, it is almost 82 degrees. Just gonna pop that guy in there and watch her come down. Ah, yes. That's what I like to see. Go, baby, go. So, I know that there's a lot of different ways to do things, and this isn't exactly the most kosher way to do this, but if your mechanic or the Honda dealership is wanting to charge you $1,500 to do this and do it with a machine and pull vacuum on your system and do all that other stuff that would normally I would do, you know, this is just an inexpensive way to do this for around, you know, even if you didn't have some of the tools, for around $100, you can get your AC back up and going if your problem is actually your expansion valve. So that's just an easy way to do it without pulling the dash, which is kind of a no-brainer. You know, who wants to pull the dash out of their car if they don't have to? So I hope this video helps someone out. If it did, please like and subscribe, and hopefully I'll post some more content that'll help more people out, and we'll go from there. Just gonna pull this guy out. Yeah, well, we were at like 53 there for a second, which is great, and that'll work. This thing's pretty quick to jump up. And that's a wrap. Now we just need to check for leaks. Here's what I was talking about earlier. If you look in there, you can't really see much, but if you don't clean up all the oil and you get a little UV light and you shine it in there, you can see it just glows like crazy. So I missed cleaning up a little spot there. But up on the upper side, we don't appear to have any leaks, which is great. We got everything buttoned up. Everything's working. AC's primo. You gotta love it. It works. I'm happy. My wife is gonna be happy. And yeah, I hope this video helps you out. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.